You'll never be good enough for my son.
Okay, Diane.
That's all you have to say?
What would you like me to say?
Marrying Michael didn't make you part of this family.
Dinner will be ready in 10 minutes.
You'll never be good enough for my son. The words came out flat, almost bored, like Diane had said them so many times they'd stopped costing her anything at all. Sarah didn't flinch. She never did anymore. 3 years had taught her exactly how to fold an insult in half and set it down quietly, the way you'd set down something breakable you didn't want to hear shatter. "Okay, Diane," she said, and kept setting the table for dinner. What Diane didn't know, what almost no one in that family knew, was about to matter more than anything she'd ever said. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why a folded napkin could feel like a wound, you have to go back to the beginning, to a spring evening 3 years earlier, when Sarah Miller first stepped into the Whitfield family home holding a bottle of wine she'd chosen carefully, hoping it would say something kind on her behalf. She was 28 then, newly in love with a man named Michael Whitfield, and she believed, the way people do at the start of things, that kindness offered honestly is usually returned in kind. Diane Whitfield opened the door that night, looked at the bottle, looked at Sarah, and said only, "We usually drink red," before turning and walking back inside. It was such a small thing. Sarah told herself it was such a small thing. She would tell herself that same sentence hundreds of times over the years that followed, and each time it would grow a little less true. What followed those first months was never dramatic enough to name out loud, which was, in its own way, the design of it. Diane never raised her voice. She never needed to. She had built an entire language out of pauses, out of the half-second too long she'd wait before saying Sarah's name, out of the way she would ask Michael questions about his week directly across the table while looking only at him, as though the chair beside him were simply empty. At family dinners, Sarah learned to anticipate the small cruelties before they arrived. The comment about girls who'd studied something more useful than art history. The story about an old girlfriend Diane had adored, told at just the right volume to make sure it reached every corner of the table. Sarah absorbed it quietly, the way she absorbed most things, because she had decided early on that dignity was not something you were given permission to have. It was something you kept, on your own terms, regardless of who was trying to take it from you. There was a particular kind of evening that repeated itself often enough to become its own quiet ritual. The Sunday dinners Diane hosted once a month, where the whole extended family gathered around a table Diane had set with the same precision she brought to everything else in her life. Sarah came to know the choreography of those evenings the way a dancer knows a routine she has performed too many times to still feel nervous about. She knew Diane would ask Michael's cousin about her new promotion before anyone had even sat down. She knew Diane would compliment Michael's sister on a dress and somehow, in the same breath, mention that Sarah's blouse looked like something practical rather than pretty. She knew that by the second course, someone would bring up the old girlfriend, a woman named Rebecca who had gone on to law school, and Diane would sigh in a way that suggested the whole table shared her disappointment in whoever had replaced her. Michael saw some of it. He would later admit, much later, that he had seen more of it than he ever let himself fully acknowledge in the moment. He loved his mother the uncomplicated way people love the first person who ever loved them, and he had spent his whole life learning how to make himself small in rooms where Diane's opinion took up all the air. When Sarah would mention it afterward, gently, not looking for a fight, but simply naming what had happened, Michael would sigh and say his mother just took time to warm up to people, that she'd come around eventually, that Sarah shouldn't take it personally. Sarah stopped correcting him after the first year, not because she agreed, but because she understood that some people cannot see a pattern until it becomes impossible to look away from. And she had decided she would rather be patient than be right in a way that changed nothing. There was a Christmas, the second one, when Diane handed out gifts to everyone at the table, wrapped carefully, ribboned, clearly chosen with thought. And when she reached Sarah, she reached instead for a folded cloth napkin sitting beside her own plate and slid it across the table without a word, as though it were simply the next item in a sequence rather than a decision made in advance. Sarah unfolded it in front of everyone, because there was nothing else to unfold, and said thank you, because that was the only sentence available to her that wouldn't hand Diane exactly what she wanted, which was a reaction. Michael's father, Richard, a quiet man who mostly stayed out of his wife's disagreements, looked down at his plate that day in a way Sarah would remember for years afterward, not because he said anything, but because for one instant, his silence looked like shame rather than neutrality. That same winter, Sarah's own mother, a woman named Carol who had raised her alone after Sarah's father passed when she was 12, asked her over the phone why she kept going back to those dinners at all. Sarah didn't have a clean answer that night. She only said that Michael was worth the discomfort, and that she had built her whole life on the belief that you don't let someone else's smallness convince you to make yourself smaller too. Carol, who had spent years watching her daughter absorb things quietly and turn them into fuel rather than wounds, told her only to be careful that patience didn't quietly become permission. Sarah thought about that phone call more than she ever admitted to anyone, especially on the mornings after those Sunday dinners, when she would sit alone in her car in the driveway for a few extra minutes before going inside to Michael, gathering herself the way she always did. What none of them knew, what Sarah had never once brought up at that table, not out of secrecy, but because she had simply stopped expecting anyone there to ask, was what she actually did with her days. She told people, when asked, that she worked in healthcare administration, and that was true in the way a small window is true of a much larger house. Sarah Miller was, by that point, the regional director of crisis operations for a network of hospitals and clinics spanning 3 counties, the person a health system called at 2 in the morning when a record system failed or a regulatory deadline threatened to shut a facility's doors. She had built that career the same way she built everything in her life, without asking anyone to notice, because she had learned a long time before she ever met the Whitfields that noise was not the same thing as worth, and that some of the strongest people in any room are the ones who never once raised their voice to prove it. She had started in that field a decade earlier as a records clerk at a single overworked clinic outside the city, filing insurance claims by hand at a desk near the back exit, and had spent every year since climbing one difficult rung at a time, learning compliance law on her lunch breaks, volunteering for the assignments no one else wanted, until the people who ran hospital networks across the region knew her name and trusted her judgment more than they trusted people with far more impressive titles. She had never once mentioned any of that at a Whitfield family dinner, because Diane had never once asked, and Sarah had learned, long before she met this family, that offering your accomplishments to someone who has already decided not to value you rarely changes their mind. It only gives them one more thing to dismiss. Diane never asked. In 3 years, she never once asked Sarah what she did, where she'd studied, what she was working toward, because Diane had decided, somewhere in that first conversation about wine, that Sarah was not someone worth being curious about. It is a particular kind of cruelty, disguised as indifference, the choice not to ask a question because you have already decided you know the answer. Sarah recognized it for what it was. She had grown up with a version of it herself, an aunt who had once told her, kindly enough on the surface, that some people were simply built for quieter lives, and Sarah had spent years afterward proving, without an audience, exactly how wrong that assumption had been. She carried that same quiet proof into the Whitfield family home every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday dinner, without once needing anyone at that table to witness it. The spring of the 3rd year, everything that had been sitting quietly beneath the surface of that family finally rose to meet them, though none of them saw it coming in the shape it actually took. Richard Whitfield collapsed at the small chain of urgent care clinics he and Diane had spent 2 decades building from a single lease storefront into 6 locations across the region, the kind of business that had quietly supported an entire extended family for years without any of them fully appreciating what it had cost to build. He was rushed to the hospital with chest pains that turned out to be manageable, stable, survivable. But the timing of his collapse landed in the middle of the worst week the business had ever faced. A ransomware attack had locked every patient record system across all 6 clinics overnight, and state regulators, following strict compliance law, gave the family 72 hours to restore secure access or face an emergency shutdown of every location. Diane spent the first day of that crisis on the phone with attorney after attorney, none of whom could move quickly enough to matter, and the second day pacing the hallway outside Richard's hospital room while her daughter, Emily, tried and failed to find an information technology consultant willing to take on 6 locked systems on such short notice. By the third morning, with the shutdown deadline closing in and Richard still under observation, Diane sat down at the kitchen table where she had once handed Sarah a folded napkin instead of a gift. And for the first time in 30 years of running that business, she admitted out loud that she did not know what to do next, and that everything her husband had built might disappear because of a deadline she barely understood. Sarah, sitting across from her exactly where she always sat, said quietly that she might know someone. Diane looked up at her the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that has suddenly spoken, not unkindly, simply startled, as though it had never once occurred to her that the woman across the table might have an answer to anything at all. What happened over the next 4 days would force Diane Whitfield to reckon with 3 years of assumptions she had never once bothered to question. Sarah picked up her phone and called people she had spent a decade building relationships with, people who knew her not as Michael's fiancée, but as the woman who had personally walked half a dozen struggling clinics back from the edge of closure, quietly, without asking for credit. She called a former colleague who now worked inside the state health department, walked him through the exact language of the compliance code that allowed for an emergency extension, and had a formal request filed before the sun came up. She called a cybersecurity team she had worked with twice before, people who trusted her enough to reroute their own schedules on a single phone call, and had them on site at all 6 clinics by early afternoon. By the third day, systems were restored, regulators had granted the extension, and the shutdown order that had threatened to end 2 decades of work had been quietly withdrawn before it ever became public. Diane watched all of it unfold from a hospital waiting room chair beside her husband's bed, half in disbelief, half in something closer to shame, as the woman she had handed a napkin to a year earlier calmly resolved a crisis that 4 separate attorneys had been unable to touch. Emily, who had spent the last 2 days on hold with consultants who never called back, sat beside her mother in stunned silence, watching Sarah move through phone calls with the same steady calm she had brought to every dinner Diane had ever made difficult for her. When it was finally over, when the systems were back online and Richard was stable and the immediate danger had passed, Diane asked her, in a voice so much smaller than the one she'd used at that first dinner 3 years before, who she actually was. Sarah didn't answer with her job title, though she could have. She said simply that she was the woman Diane had been calling her for 3 years, and that she hadn't needed Diane to know what she did for a living. She had only ever needed Diane to treat her like a person while she didn't know. Diane didn't have an answer for that, not that day, not for several weeks afterward, because some truths take longer to sit with than others, and Diane had never once in her life been asked to sit with the consequences of her own assumptions. She went home that night and sat alone in the same kitchen where the napkin had once changed hands, turning the last 3 years over in her mind, remembering 100 small moments she had never once thought to question, and for the first time she understood that her silence at that table had never been neutral. It had been a decision, repeated over and over, to withhold from someone the basic respect she had never once had to earn back. Real change rarely arrives all at once, and what followed in the months after was not a single dramatic apology, but a slow, uneven unlearning that Sarah watched with the same patience she had brought to every dinner before it. Diane showed up unannounced at Sarah's office one afternoon, sat in the waiting room for the better part of an hour without explaining why, and when Sarah finally came out to see her, Diane said only that she had been wrong about her for 3 years and didn't expect that to undo anything. But she needed Sarah to hear her say it out loud. Sarah didn't need the apology to know her own worth. She had never once built that worth on Diane's approval to begin with. But she nodded, and for the first time in 3 years, she poured Diane a cup of coffee instead of setting a table for her. They sat together for almost an hour that afternoon, longer than any conversation they had shared across 3 years of dinners, and Diane asked her, for the first time, real questions about her work, about the clinics she'd helped save long before this one, about the mother who had raised her alone. Sarah answered honestly, without performing gratitude for finally being asked, and somewhere in that hour, something between them shifted from what it had been into something neither of them fully had a name for yet. Not friendship exactly, but the beginning of one. Michael, watching his mother and the woman he loved sit across from each other without an insult or a folded napkin between them, finally said the thing he had spent 3 years failing to say, that he should have defended her a long time ago, and that he was sorry it had taken this long for him to mean it. Sarah told him she knew, and that he would spend the rest of their life together making up for it, not as a punishment, but as a promise they were both choosing to keep. He asked her, quietly, why she had never once asked him to choose between them, why she had simply endured it instead. Sarah told him the truth, that she had never wanted a version of him that only loved her when it was easy, and that she had trusted, even in the hardest moments, that he would eventually become the man who didn't need to be asked. At their wedding the following spring, Diane stood up during the toasts, unscripted, unplanned, and told the room that the strongest person she had ever met had spent 3 years allowing her to be wrong about her, because Sarah had decided long before Diane ever did that her worth was never going to depend on being seen by someone who wasn't yet ready to look. She raised her glass to her daughter-in-law and said her name the way it had always deserved to be said, because it had mattered the entire time, whether or not anyone at that table had been willing to notice. Richard, standing beside his wife, added only that he had watched Sarah's quiet strength for 3 years without ever finding the courage to say so, and that he hoped one day to deserve the family she had chosen to save. Years later, when people asked Sarah how she had endured 3 years of being underestimated by someone she saw every month, she never described it as forgiveness exactly, and she never described it as revenge either. She said only that she had decided, long before any of them knew who she really was, that her dignity did not need an audience to be real, and that the people who finally see you clearly are not owed credit for the years they spent looking away. They are only owed the chance, if they take it, to finally get it right. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments which moment hit you hardest, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.